All right, we're going to continue on in this area, and we want to talk about the 13 do's and don'ts of communication. As I said, this is probably somewhat of a wrap up, and I hope that we are able to synthesize the volume of scriptures that God has given to us. So here we go. Number one, we need to be a ready listener. A ready listener. And you might say, well, that's pretty obvious. Well, remember, many times I have given you illustrations to where if someone is speaking to you and you don't like or appreciate what they're saying, you tune out and you're already preparing your rebuttal to what they're saying. Being a ready listener is a choice on our part. We have to choose. And what are we choosing against? We're choosing against our own emotions. We're choosing against our mind that is working overtime, that wants to stand up for what or stand against what that person is saying. And so we have to choose to listen. Sometimes you're going to have to stop what you're doing to give full attention to the person who is talking to you. Okay, I'm going to ask that everybody mute their mics because there is a rattling noise that is taking place and we are recording. So if you would mute your mics, I would appreciate that and everybody else would appreciate it as well. So first of all, be a ready listener. Okay. Proverbs 18:13, he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. And so truly, this will take place if I have tuned out. When I speak the next time, it's going to show folly and it's going to bring embarrassment to me because I really didn't listen to what the person was saying. Number two, be slow to speak. Be slow to speak. In Proverbs 15:23, it says, a man has joy in an apt answer, and how delightful is a timely word. Timely word. And in verse 28 of the same chapter, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. And of course, James chapter 1, verse 19 says that we are to be slow to speak and quick to hear and slow to anger. So just a reminder, as a ready listener, I think being slow to speak will go hand in hand with the conversation. And then don't go to bed angry. Colossians chapter 3, verse 8 says this. Colossians 3:8, but now you also put them all aside. Now he's talking about things that we allow to build up in our life. We have a choice to put aside what? Anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive speech from your mouth. And of course, the verse that is most often quoted is Ephesians 5:15. Be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise. But then in verse 25, these are not the right verses here. That should be, I'm in the wrong chapter. Ephesians 4:15, but speaking the truth in love. And then verse 25, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not let the sun go down on your anger. And I've mentioned this, I think, at least once, maybe twice. Oftentimes, disputes will occur near the end of the day, and it is not wise. If you were to ask me for counsel, I would counsel you. It is not wise for you to try to talk about a situation that there is pretty serious diametric opposing viewpoints on things. And my counsel would be based on the fact that you are emotionally, mentally, physically, and perhaps even spiritually exhausted and tired. How are you going to be able to be a ready listener, being able to be slow to speak when you are exhausted, when you are tired? Now, for you ladies who have tuned in, this is sometimes a excuse that your husband will use. Well, I'm tired right now. We'll talk about it tomorrow. And tomorrow never comes. Husbands, you're wrong in doing that. If you're not tired, deal with the situation. But if there is tiredness there, you're just drained. And you know, if you're drained, you need to be honest with your spouse and say, look, babe, I'm just not with it. My mind is all over the place. I'm really physically exhausted. It's been a very difficult day out on the job. It's been cold. I know we have a situation we need to talk about. I agree with you. This is a problem we need to talk about. Can we agree to go to bed tonight? And tomorrow, when I come home from work after dinner, let's get a pot of coffee going or some tea going, and let's sit down and talk about it. And during that time, I will prepare myself to be able to come in and listen to you and hear your concerns and be able to direct our attention back to the Word of God on how to answer this. That is counsel that I've given before about this verse. Some people take it literally, and I've had a couple of couples when I was in full-time counseling would take this literally, and they would be up until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning trying to resolve a situation. And it really didn't get resolved. One person or the other just capitulated. Yeah, honey, you're right. I was all wrong. I love you. Let's go to bed. Nothing really got solved. So if you can take this literally before the sun goes down, and depends on what time zone you're on, you might want to think about what I have mentioned. Number 4, do not use silence to frustrate the other person. In Proverbs chapter, let's see, where am I at here? In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19. And I think, unfortunately, we have all experienced this in a relationship. You sense something is wrong in the relationship. The person's countenance has changed. There is an abruptness when they answer a question that you ask them. You just have lived with this person long enough and you know the signals that my mate is upset about something. And so you ask a dumb question. Guys ask dumb questions, okay? And the guy will ask his wife, what's wrong? And the guy knows what's wrong. That's the dumbness of the question. But the spouse will say, oh, nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong. Everything's okay. Nothing's wrong. Well, a couple things are going on here. Number one, the wife is lying, or the other person is lying when they deny that there is a problem that needs to be talked about. They are not being honest and truthful. They're violating Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. And the other person, in asking that question, is knowingly trying to water down what the situation might be when they ask the question, well, what's wrong? And they know what's wrong. This is not good communication. And silence is used, and it's only going to frustrate the other person. The longer, listen to me, the longer the silence takes place when there is a problem in the relationship, the more distorted the problem becomes. Let me say that again. The longer silence is used to avoid discussing what the problem might be is only going to make the problem bigger and larger, exasperate it, make it larger than life because of the silence. Well, how can this be? Well, when somebody is silent with you and you are being, and you know there's a problem, what is your mind doing? Your mind is running down all of the dark alleys. What did I do wrong? Maybe it was this. Maybe it was that. Maybe I shouldn't have said this. Maybe I should have said something different. But I don't think I really said anything wrong. What's the matter with her? What's the matter with him? And you're playing a ping pong game by yourself. Remember, you used to be able to do this. You lifted one end of the ping pong table up and you could practice. That's what you're doing when we use silence. It's going to frustrate the other person. Number 5, do not become involved in quarrels. Try to avoid quarrels. Romans chapter 13, verse 13 says this. Romans 13:13. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity or sensuality, not in strife and jealousy. I think it was last week or the week before when we talked about circuit jammers, that there was a verse in Proverbs that says, abandon the quarrel. If you don't, it's like letting water out of a dam. Abandon the quarrel. Well, Rick, doesn't that mean I'm just giving in to this person? And if I give in to this person, they're going to believe that they are right all the time and I'm wrong. And I'm going to lose my identity. I'm going to lose my willingness or my ability to even say, hey, wait a minute, that's not quite the way it was. You and I, in our relationships, know when it's moved beyond conversation and conflict resolution into a quarrel. Everyone listening knows when that line takes place. You know when you've crossed it. How do you know? How do you know when you're involved with a quarrel? Well, let me make this suggestion to you. One way that you know that you're involved with quarreling is that you are attacking the person, not the problem. You're attacking the person, not the problem. You're being quarrelsome. You're being quarrelsome. We are to avoid that. People represent problems, but people are not necessarily the problem. It's how they think and how that thinking motivates them to act. This is important when we are trying to do conflict resolution, that we do not attack the person. We are looking to address the problem and all of the intricacies of that problem. Taking care of a large problem, beloved, is like trying to untangle a ball of yarn. And you pull and you pull, and then it gets tightened up over here, and you have to untie that knot. And then you do a little bit more, and here's a knot over here. Or trying to roll up an extension cord, a very long extension cord that was not properly rolled up in the first place, and it's all kinked and twisted. And so you got to stretch it out, try to smooth it out, and try to wrap it up more, if you please, professionally, or more better, so it will be more useful for you. Avoid quarrels. Number 6, do not respond in anger. Do not respond in anger or in uncontrollable anger. Proverbs 14, verse 29. Let me go back to there. Proverbs 14, verse 29. You're going to notice that some of these verses we have looked at before. There can be several applications from these verses. So Proverbs 14:29 says this: He who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. Do not respond in uncontrolled anger. Now, the operative word there is what? Uncontrolled anger. Ephesians tells us to be angry, but do not sin. Jesus was angry. He drove sinful people who were distorting the law out of the temple. Moses was angry when he threw the tablets down and he saw the people committing idolatry. There is a righteous anger. And a righteous anger, if you take a look at that in the Bible, has nothing to do with the person who is being angry. It's the object of what they are angry about. Was Jesus angry for himself? Was Moses angry for himself? No, they were angry because people were distorting, defaming, mocking the Word of God, mocking God's principles. If I have anger, it has to be in alignment with God Himself, because God can be, and oftentimes is, angry because His creation is sinning against Him. Uncontrolled anger is about myself, about my rights, about what I think should take place, when it should take place, how it should take place. And then number 7, when you are wrong, admit it and ask forgiveness. Matthew chapter 5, and you'll remember this from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is talking to his disciples and telling them what a kingdom saint should look like, because he's about to send them out to preach the gospel 2 by 2. And so in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 and 24, it says, Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you. Now that's very interesting there, isn't it? If you stop and look at that verse, it doesn't say you're at church and you're about to put your envelope in the offering plate, and there you remember that you are angry with your brother. That's not what it says. It says that you know your brother is angry with you. I cannot find in the scriptures where the person who is wronged sits back on their haunches in the corner of the sandbox and waits for the other person who has wronged them to come to them. As a general rule, the person who is wronged is always the instigator to try to resolve the situation. Jay Adams used to say, the person who is wrong knows so because their toes have been stepped on. Many times, the person who is committing the wrong they're not aware of it to the degree of the offensiveness to the person it's been leveled against. So if you're wrong, I don't like the word admit. If you're wrong, confess it. See, admit is kind of a psychology term. Yeah, I guess I was wrong. No. If you're wrong, And that word should be changed as well. If you have sinned, confess it and ask forgiveness. Ask forgiveness. And you remember years ago, I did a series on that. Number 8, when another confesses to you, tell the person that you forgive him. 1 Peter 4:8. We're going to go back over there. 1 Peter 4:8. It says this. Get my fingers working here. 1 Peter 4:8. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. When another confesses to you, and notice the operative word confess, 1 John 1:9, they come to you and identify their actions or attitudes like God would if God were coming to you. So in other words, when they confess, they're going to say, I've lied, I've spoken evil about you, I have stolen time from you as my employer, whatever it is, you have to identify the sin. And when that person does that, you now are obligated to do something with that confession. And if you can go back in your notes or in your memory, the third message that we talked about forgiveness was how to properly forgive the person who has asked your forgiveness. And if you remember, you cannot say, oh, that's okay. You cannot say, well, don't let it happen again. You cannot say, oh, I understand why you did it. God forgives me. He tells me I forgive you when I confess. And we must do the same for someone who comes to me and says, look, I have sinned against you, and they identify the sin. Now I am obligated to say, I forgive you. If I don't utter those words, I am now guilty of sinning by violating the scriptures. You see, when you tell a person, I forgive you, remember, you're making a threefold promise. You're making a threefold promise. Number one, I promise not to bring it up to that person again. So no throwing it back in their face. Even if they do the same thing again. Remember Luke, the person does the same thing 7 times in one day. When Jesus told Peter, you're supposed to forgive him. So when you say, I forgive you, I'm making a promise to the person. I'm not going to bring it back up to them again. I'm not going to rub it in their face. Second of all, I'm making a promise to God to keep his word and not bring it back up again. Because God doesn't bring up my past sins to me, does he? And third of all, I'm making a promise to myself. I'm not going to sit there and dwell upon it. I'm not going to rehearse the details. I'm not going to second guess, why did you forgive this person? Don't you know they're going to do it again? Now, first of all, you don't know they're going to do it again per se. So this is important theology here. When another confesses to you, you are obligated to tell them, I forgive you, understanding what you mean when you make that statement. And then avoid nagging. We looked at that last week. I'm not going to go to these passages. Remember these verses that talk about it's better to be on the roof than with a nagging wife in the corner of a house than with a wife who is a dripping faucet. Nagging. Constant fault finding. Constant picking. A person who nags is an unhappy person. They are a critical person. Somewhere along the line, they have been disappointed by somebody. And nagging, for some, becomes their suit of armor to protect themselves from being hurt again. And so they'll nag. They'll nag. And then number 10, do not blame or criticize the other person. Do not blame or criticize the other person. What we're talking about here is the pursuit of restoring that person. Back to Romans chapter 14, verse 13. It says this. Romans 14:13. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. We are all prone to blame somebody else. We're very prone to criticize another person. Well, if they only had done it this way, if they would just have listened to me, oh, it wasn't my fault. He's the one that started it. How many times did you hear that raising your kids? One child blaming the other child. This does not help with communication. This does nothing to restore the person. So to avoid blaming and criticizing, you need to identify biblically what the problem is. You need to identify biblically what the solution is, and you need to agree to implement the biblical solution and encourage that person to press forward with the biblical solution. Many times in counseling, I have provided counseling to a person in a marriage relationship and given them some things to work on and instructed them to share with their mate what they were going to be working on. And they would come back in, and you always check homework when the counselor comes back in. Hey, how'd you do with your homework? Give me an update. What's going on? And many, many times, more than I care to remember, this person tried to put into practice the biblical teaching and instructions that were given in the previous counseling session, tried to implement some of the various elements of the fruit of the Spirit, and they come back and report that their mate still criticized them. Their mate still blamed them. Oh, yeah, you're trying to make changes, but you know you're going to go back and do that again. You're never going to be able to keep this up. You're just doing this to get me back. They need encouragement, beloved. They need encouragement. And maybe that's one of the motivations to move into our next study on how to provide hope to the discouraged person. And it's not just pray about it. And then number 11, if someone verbally attacks you, do not respond in kind. And Proverbs 26 talks about responding to a fool lest you become like him. But in 1 Peter chapter 2, there we are. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. And while being reviled, this is talking about Christ now, while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And then in chapter 3, verse 9, it says, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. So if someone verbally attacks me, we should not respond the same way that they are responding to me. A good study on this would be obviously the Gospels and Christ, where he was attacked verbally and even physically when we get down to the Passion Week and the crucifixion, standing before Pilate, he didn't justify anything. He answered questions biblically, but he didn't defend himself. He didn't respond back to the, well, your taxes are nonsense. Why are you taxing this so severely? He didn't get involved with that. And frankly, Paul did not either. So if someone attacks you, do not respond. Now let me suggest this to you. Generally, verbal attacks are going to be slingshots at your character. It's going to be slingshots at your character. I can handle verbal disagreements over a project or on how something must be done. But you and I get very defensive when someone attacks us verbally and our character. You always, you never, if you only, they're attacking our character. Now, here's a thought for us. How can a Christian attack the character of another Christian? How can they do that? Biblically, they can't. Because by attacking my character, that Christian is attacking God. And James prohibits that. In fact, James calls it sin. Now, I can attack your conduct. What you are doing is sin. What you are doing is lust. Do you realize the jeopardy you're going to put your family in? Do you see this as irresponsible? What are you doing? You're addressing the conduct of the person. Number 12, try to understand the other person's viewpoint. Now, there's no specific scriptures on this, but I think if you take a look at the characters in the Bible who had difficult communication issues or relationships, they tried to understand the other person's viewpoint. You know what comes to my mind at this particular point? What comes to my mind is, I believe it was King Artaxerxes and Esther. You also have Nehemiah and Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes can't be with Esther as well. But let's focus in on Nehemiah, okay? Nehemiah was troubled by something. His silence gave him away. He and the king had a very close relationship, and the king noticed that he was sad, and he asks Nehemiah, what's going on? And Nehemiah, after throwing up a prayer, according to Nehemiah chapter 2, responded to the king in somewhat of a kind of a blunt way, if you look at the scriptures. Instead of saying, oh, my king, I'm so sad because of how my people are living back in Jerusalem. They're living in squalor. They're living and they're depressed. You know what he does? Yo, king, if your city was destroyed and your people were living in poverty, you'd be upset too. He just put it out there. And Artaxerxes did not get upset with him. He understood Nehemiah's position. How do we know that? Because he said, Nehemiah, what do you want? And how long are you going to be gone? What do you need? And when are you coming back? Try to understand the other person's viewpoint. We are all individuals. We all have different perspectives on situations. And there can be 6 different ways to accomplish a project, and all 6 ways could be valid. Now, out of those 6 ways, probably only 1 or 2 are going to be the best use of time, energy, and resources. But let's avoid arguing about methodology and stay focused on the goal. And then finally, be concerned about the other person's opinion. Philippians chapter 2, let me go back there. Philippians chapter 2, and this is talking about Christ's attitude. Philippians 2:4, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. In chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, it says this, let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude. And if anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. However, let us keep living by the same standard to which we have obtained. You see, we can have a difference of opinion on something, but there's only one standard everybody needs to submit to. And that's very, very important, because too often, I think many of us have seen it, I certainly have, too often I have seen such disagreements over methodology, how something should be done, as opposed to what is the goal, what is the responsibility that should be taking place. So next time we get together, we are going to begin a study on providing genuine hope to the discouraged. Genuine hope to the discouraged. As mentioned earlier, this was material that I wrote, and it systematically goes through practical ways on how to give hope to somebody who is discouraged. Hope is not a cookie cutter presentation of memorized, standardized verses. In order to give hope, you have to know the person. You have to recognize the length that they have been involved in their present situation, and you need to know the duration of it. Those things are very important in providing hope. For example, if somebody just misspent some money for this month, they do not have that quality or characteristic, then they will need probably a brief measure of hope to help them get back on track. But if you come across somebody who is perpetually mismanaging their money, perpetually getting into debt, perpetually approaching people with their hand out, that is going to require much more intense hope for them. So we're going to learn the different ways we can provide hope. We're going to learn who needs hope. We're going to learn what hope is. Hope, many times people think is a hope so. Well, I hope that I will get this for Christmas. Biblical hope is a confidence and an assurance of God and his power to work. There's a big difference. All right, does anybody have any thoughts from great readers?